So thanks for having us. You could actually think from the presentations this morning with, there's a bit of kumbaya going on here, that, the problem's just in America, and when you do the survey here, what's the problem? And we should be anticipating the problem. Well, let me tell you, from the people on this panel, including me, we've got a problem. We have merchants of misinformation, we have people running interference, we have political agendas, there's stuff happening, and it's under the surface, possibly not being picked up by the surveys, but we need to watch out. And so this is just some mad journalist rather than an august fellow of the academy. But from where I sit, we've got a problem. And if we don't watch out, that problem's going to increase, and the solutions are not necessarily the ones that have been put on the table so far. So let's go. We have a great panel. We've got Sharon Friel, Professor Sharon Friel, who's Director of the Australian Research Centre for Health Equity and Planetary Health Equity here at the ANU. Professor Raglan Maddox, who is Senior Fellow of the Yardara Walani National Centre for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Wellbeing at NCEF, the National Centre for Epidemiology and Population Health, again here at the ANU, clearly centre of great mistrust at the ANU. And Professor Raina McIntyre, who is Professor and Head of Biosecurity Programme and the founder of EpiWatch, which is a pandemic basically a pandemic watch program. And last but not least, Liam Mannix, who is National Science Reporter for The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald, part of the Night Network. Please welcome our panel. Sharon, don't make a liar of me. We got a problem?
I couldn't possibly disagree with you, Norman. Yes, we do. And it's very constructed. I mean, I think for us, what we'll hear across the discussions in this panel is this very concerted, deliberate strategy of disinformation. I'm not talking about misinformation, I'm talking about disinformation, where it is a very intentional practice by a range of conservative elites, a range of fringe groups, a range of corporations who use just a suite of strategies and tactics to obscure the truth, shift public opinion, keep the politicians on their side, make the politicians love them. Some of them are the politicians. And part of the strategies that get used by these different types of actors are some of the narratives and that framing we were speaking about before coffee. But it's also funding front groups. Why might we go along to an oral health conference and the flyers that are given out don't mention sugar? Which is true, that's happened. They don't mention sugar, and because, of course, it was the sugar industry that was producing the flyers that were being fed into the GPs. Or the fact that the announcement in The Guardian just this morning, one of the headlines was, and I wrote it down because, as you know, I remember nothing, heat deaths aren't a thing. That was from some of the coalition MPs. That's a very, very particular, deliberate planting of doubt about the science for climate change. We'll hear it in climate change, we'll hear it in tobacco, we'll hear it. It happens across pharmaceuticals. We were just remembering also about Ozempic, how Ozempic have acted in a very concerted way to construct a medical condition. So there's a whole ways. So why do they do it? Why is this something that just this notion of trust is insufficient to address? It's because the social license, as Joan mentioned, it's about making us...
Let's just stick on the social license for a moment. Let's play that out a little bit when you talk about that, because it trips off the tongue, but what do you actually mean?
Well, so let me give you an example. Remember, our Prime Minister, Albanese, was going round the country at the time of the referendum, for the voice to Parliament. And you may have seen the pictures where he was given a T-shirt by Rio Tinto. And on the T-shirt, it had his name. So there was Anthony, and there was Rio Tinto. What was that about? That was a halo effect for Rio Tinto, one of the most extractive industries in Australia. That was Rio Tinto saying, we are part of this very progressive movement that was about the yes vote. We're here helping in rural and remote Australia. It's about saying, Prime Minister Albanese, please don't touch me. Please let me have my social licence to continue to exist, to extract.
So it's the licence to operate.
It's the licence to operate.
In your area of inequity, disparities, there's plenty of public health researchers in this room who've devoted their life to reducing disparities. What evidence have you got that this sort of misinformation is hampering policy in this area?
Extensive. So I spend a lot of time looking at this intersection with climate change, inequality and health, and really trying to understand these structures of obstruction to action on climate change and on inequality, and then ultimately what that means for health. And in the world of the commercial determinants of health, which is a vast world, could be bigger. Folks in the room start studying the commercial determinants of health, please. But in that world, there is evidence about tobacco, alcohol, gambling, vaping, fossil fuels, how the pharmaceutical companies are funding consumer groups to go forth and advance. So there's extensive evidence about a suite of practices that are used, not just specific to these different products that I've just mentioned, but these are common practices. They're universal across all these big corporations. I'm not against business, I'm against these nefarious practices of big corporations. And what we've seen is through the political donations, through the lobbying, I mean, the folks that are constantly in Parliament House are the lobbyists who are there saying, we can help you. Can we sit on a policy committee to talk about X, Y, and Z? Can we sit on the dietary guidelines committee? We'll help you put environmental sustainability and equity in the dietary guidelines committee, and then at the last minute.
It should be said, the food industry sits on those guidelines.
Yeah. I was there on the committee with them, and at the last minute they say, no, we will not. This is not fit for purpose evidence. It's a very deliberate, a very, very concerted strategy to do that. And so it just pulls back on any political party wanting to touch these corporations, and therefore no policy or regulation.
So Raglan, you've been looking at tobacco and vaping as almost like a case study here.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating case study. I think we think about the harm that the tobacco and nicotine industry continues to cause. The work of Professor Banks highlights that the industry fuels 66 Australian deaths every day. Over 24,000 Australians will die from tobacco-related death and disease this year. And if we're talking about misinformation, disinformation, we've known that tobacco kills when used as directed for over 75 years, but we still see it at retail shops around Australia. We know that there are other products. We look at asbestos, leaded petrol, leaded paint, solariums, engineered stone. That health impact is significant, but it's not killing 66 Australians every day, and they've been removed from the market. So the tobacco industry, as Professor Banks outlined earlier, part of their core business is to generate misinformation, disinformation, doubt, so they continue to socialise their product as an everyday consumer product, so they continue to sell it. And we see now with newer products like e-cigarettes or vaping devices or nicotine pouches that as their model, business model continues to evolve, that they need to recruit new customers. And so the way that they do that is by engineering addiction in different ways. So they generate things like e-cigarettes that we know cause harm. The magnitude of harm we are unsure of, but we know they cause at least short-term harms.
And if people in the audience think this is imaginary, Philip Morris was one of the biggest manufacturers of nicotine vapes.
Yeah, so we know Philip Morris invests in that. We know Japan Tobacco has invested in it. We know that they're involved in some of the heavy investment into that. We also know they have a legal obligation to act in their best interest of their shareholders. So they're not going to do this out of the goodness of their heart. They might tell you that they're trying to make a safer, in quotation, product. Our job is to keep our consumers alive so that we can continue to profit from it. But the reality is that they continue to harm Australians every day. And I talk about mortality, morbidity, quality of life, dealing with addiction, mental health, anxiety.
So give me a flavour of what you have to deal with, given that you are trying to promote a public health argument around nicotine vapes and tobacco. What do you find is there tangibly that you're up against?
We're up against a suite of things, as Sharon sort of mentioned. There's sort of, I guess, three levels in the way I see it. I see the tobacco industry generally tries to write policy. We're lucky that we have the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control.
But you don't see the tobacco industry. It's other people, isn't it?
Yeah, so let me get to that. So the idea is that the industry will write the policy. If they can't write the policy, they'll generate front groups or what they call astroturfing groups, so retail association, consumer associations, others. They'll find a researcher somewhere that might have some influence and people might listen to it. It might be a criminologist, it might be anybody. And you'll see that they toe the industry line. So one of the things Sharon was talking about is this, the way we engineer things, or a narrative around personal choice. So one of the challenges I have with tobacco is addiction is not a personal choice. The actual process of addiction or dependence removes personal choice. We know the majority of people who take up smoking or vaping take up this product at a young age and then have a lifelong addiction that leads to cancers, cardiovascular disease, all those things. So removing that personal choice is part of the narrative that they engineer. They're the architects of addiction, and they socialise it. So when we pick up the paper, we'll see that actually the issue is tax is too high. We know that there are too many retailers. But the conversation isn't about public health. It isn't about the industry profiting off the deaths of Australians and filling up our hospitals. The conversation is how do we reduce taxes on products and make it more cheaper and more accessible for everyday Australians to access this addictive product that will kill people when used as directed.
So just to bring this together, when we're talking about trust as the overall message, the overall theme of today, what we're talking about here is whether you can trust public policy in a sense because of this misinformation. I'll come to you secondly, because I know you're champing at the bit here. But Ryan, you've been the butt of some of these campaigns yourself, and you're trying to promote science-based infectious disease information.
Yeah, so I think the COVID pandemic has resulted in a
You might not
huge...
be on.
The COVID pandemic has resulted in a huge pushback against public health. Everything that was done that was part of the response, vaccines, masks, countermeasures, etc., are all seen as coercive controls. I think vaccine hesitancy has risen around the world. As someone, I think Louise mentioned this morning, the pretty alarming drop in childhood vaccination rates to 90% at the age of 2. We're now at that threshold where we will see, we will lose measles elimination status if nothing is done about it. So, and I'll just give you 2 anecdotes to tell you how big I think the problem is. One was the end of last year, I was in the emergency waiting to be seen in a cubicle, and the person next to me had an animal bite, and the doctor was telling them they needed a tetanus booster. And he just flat out refused and said, I'm not having it. I know 31 people who died. And so she says to him, died of what? And he said, COVID vaccines. And now that, according to the TGA, there have been 14 deaths from COVID vaccines in Australia over all time, and 13 of those were from the AstraZeneca vaccine and 1 was an mRNA vaccine death. Of course, the doctor didn't have those stats at her fingertips. She didn't argue with him. He was demanding antibiotics. She started off saying, no, you don't need antibiotics, but she ended up just giving him the antibiotics and, you know, not discussing it, because she didn't have the tools and the resources to discuss it with him. But to me, if someone like your average Joe Blow out there thinks the tetanus booster is dangerous, we have a huge problem in the community, a huge problem. That wasn't some random aberration. That is telling me what's going on there in the community. The second anecdote is a GP friend of mine who got really, really sick with COVID about 2 years ago, and I said to her, when did you have your last booster? And she said, oh no, I haven't had a booster. I don't want mRNA in my body. So it's actually a chapter in my book, I Don't Want mRNA in My Body. I've got a book that covers this whole thing, and that line really stuck with me. I didn't have the heart to tell her actually she does have mRNA in her body. But so she was influenced by the same disinformation and misinformation that is affecting the community. And I think just like we talked about people with vested interests, you both talked about people being willing to be ambassadors for these toxic influences. There are plenty of medical people out there in the medical profession who have jumped on that bandwagon and who are essentially spreading disinformation. And it started with the Great Barrington Declaration, and now people involved in that are on the Immunisation Peak Committee in the US. They've formed their own medical journal called the Journal of the Academy of Public Health. It looks really prestigious and impressive, and the first thing you look, if you go and look it up, is something about how dangerous Tylenol is, right? So they're going to use, so not only is there a rise in predatory publishing, but there's also a rise in these pseudoscientific, deliberately, false sort of these journals that are pushing an agenda that is not scientific. So, and the peak bodies in the US, like in the US until the middle of this year, allowed children 6 months and over to have a COVID vaccine. Australia didn't, and the UK didn't. The UK was heavily influenced by, I think, by some of the Great Barrington arguments. And when you listen to the arguments that they spout, it goes like this. It goes, oh, it's mainly, children don't get really sick. It's okay. The vaccine is more dangerous. Now, that is the classic anti-vaxxer argument that we've been dealing with for other childhood vaccines for 30 years. That's the argument, right? Polio, yeah, it's mild for most people. Most children get asymptomatic infection. Tiny, tiny fraction, less than 1%, get paralytic polio. And that's true for every disease we vaccinate children against. That when infection is widespread, your hospitals are full of people on iron lungs, right? It's a consequence of mass infection that you see the pointy end of it in the morbidity and mortality. So I think to me, it's really concerning that there's a rise in disinformation and misinformation being spread by the medical community as well, by sections of it.
So there's a normalisation going on of misinformation, is what you're arguing.
Yeah, but also it's very difficult, I think, for busy GPs and stuff. It's really difficult to actually find the information, and they're not hearing as much official messaging. They're just hearing the disinformation. And like mRNA vaccines, and I think governments everywhere in the world, it's not just our governments, and I say governments in the plural, are scared to say the C word, which is COVID, because it's so triggering to a lot of people. People experienced a lot of hardship and loss and suffering during COVID, and so I think politicians, they'll lose the next election if they talk about COVID. So they don't talk about it. So there's dead silence and this huge amount of disinformation, and even doctors are confused.
So before I come to Liam, just again to put perspective on this, if you think there's not a problem, why do we still have gambling advertising when 7 out of 10 Australians want it banned and there would be no harm in banning it? Why don't we have a sugar tax when it's proven to work, randomised trials show that. You have to ask why these policies, which have evidence behind them, have not happened, and we still don't have volumetric pricing of alcohol. Therefore, in Aboriginal communities, it's cheaper to buy cask wine than water. Again, that's the South Australian lobby in Parliament. So if you think it's all hunky-dory, it isn't, and we have to ask why. Liam, it's all your fault.
I didn't realise I was on trial up here, Norman. Can I pick up on something that Rania mentioned? Because I think that does play into a problem that we really have, which is I think we're reasonably good at debunking low-quality misinformation. Like the gentleman who wrote to me a couple of days ago and said, we're wrong about where the moon is. It's much closer than it appears. We're pretty good at handling that stuff. The stuff that I think we really struggle with, as you hit on, is when people who have scientific titles and scientific eminence might want to come out and say things that aren't backed up by consensus scientific positions. And I'm thinking here of ivermectin, which was created as a problem for the world in a high-quality scientific lab in Melbourne, initially publicised by scientists who are respected, and then I think really heavily promoted by some very earnest scientists who had done a lot of work over the years to win their status.
You're talking about ivermectin?
Ivermectin, yeah. Yes. That's the sort of thing that I think we really struggle with. So specialists like me can sort of work on this because we can speak to a lot of scientists and understand the consensus position, and this is what Norman does so well as well. But for the average journalist, they're looking at a scientist who's qualified, who's university tenured. It's kind of hard for them to say, you know what, I don't believe you, you're not right. And I think this is somewhere where the academies can really play a bit of a role in sort of guiding us to who are the voices we should listen to and who should we be more sceptical of.
But the media is not uniform. And if you take Raina and I, over time, particularly during COVID, it's the Daily Mail, it's News Limited, and they purvey, if there's misinformation going, they're the ones purveying it, to be blunt.
Absolutely.
But the country doesn't, I'm not sure the audience knows that.
Should we rag on the Daily Mail, Norman?
Yeah, let's have some fun.
Please don't read them. What's the fantastic statistic from them? You can read a dozen new ways to cure cancer and to prevent cancer every day, and they'll often be the same thing. It's great.
Sorry, Sharon?
Well, it was just, so you said please don't read them. I think it's really important that we read them. I think it's really important that we read that trash. But because what we're talking about is understanding the messy systems that are at play in trying to influence policy and regulation, ultimately. And that gets affected by so many different voices, and so many of the voices that folks like the Daily Mail are speaking to have the ear of some of the most extreme politicians, etc. And what we're seeing is their increasing voice. So understanding the variety of worlds, the variety of interests, and understanding, therefore, how to counter some of those narratives, I think is really, really important. But please don't start writing like the Daily Mail.
Well, to make a more serious comment, and you may disagree with me on this, Norman, I sometimes think we may focus too much on the role of the mainstream media here, and fail to understand how fundamentally the attention economy has changed. We're no longer the biggest, baddest gorillas in the attention economy. It's people like Joe Rogan. It's people like Andrew Huberman. Like if you talk to my friends, young men of the age of 30 to 35, those are their scientific influences. I think we think a lot about how to get science coverage right in mainstream media, whereas perhaps for bodies like you could be thinking more, how can we have a bigger influence in social media? How can we have a bigger influence in the attention economy?
Yeah, I mean, witness the fact that Bernie Sanders made sure he got onto Joe Rogan to have that discussion. But I want to actually talk to you about that because, and we've alluded to it earlier, which is that for example, there was a study maybe 6 weeks ago on contraception advice on TikTok and how almost none of it is evidence-based. A lot of it's about the rhythm method. They never say there's a 22% failure rate. But when you look at the qualifications, almost nobody's qualified, but the people who, to Raina's point, the people who were qualified were also talking bullshit. So the question is, if that's where people are getting their information, should we be in that medium? What's your view on that, Liam? I'll ask the others that question too.
I think you should. There is a gentleman named Chris Hayes. He's very good. He's done a lot of studies of the attention economy. And his argument is that you need to almost try and be the gorilla in the attention economy if you want to grab people's attention and pull it to you. It's really hard to compete with misinformation, as I'm sure we'll get to, because it's very seductive. It's simple answers that are easily told. It's attractive stories. That's why it rises to the top and propagates. I suspect the solution to a lot of this is to go out there very aggressively, as they say, always be posting, and build your own ability to get out and influence people in this attentional economy. I think that's where the gains are really going to be made.
Ryan? Do you have a view on this?
I do. I mean, I've still got an X account because I want to see what people are saying. It's important to me in the work I do to understand what, the purveyors of misinformation are saying.
But do you fancy yourself as a TikTok star here?
I've never used TikTok, but,
So if you look at Aboriginal communities, young kids are using these social media, possibly at a higher level than the general community.
Yeah, I think it's not an either-or conversation. I think we need to be doing better across the board. All the work that we do is governed by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We work with local Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in driving health messages. So for us, we do a little bit on social media. We know that...
And you've been using influencers for a long time, football players and sports people and so on.
Yeah, I think influencers, role models, it's sort of inherent in any community work. There are different types of people that are incredibly influential. So we've got local champions, uncles, aunties, people that will promote being smoke-free. We have regional champions. You might have, we've got a panel coming up which has got CEOs from peak bodies.
So, I mean, during COVID, there were some Aboriginal communities who were incredibly strongly against immunisation. There was a really strong anti-vax. And coming back to the original presentation on the Gini coefficient, it was amongst the poorest and most remote Aboriginal communities. Did we ever tie down why that happened?
I think there's... Gosh, that's a complicated question. I think, and it actually comes to a couple of points that we've talked to today. And I think one is making sure that context is really critical. Time, place, space specific. So when we look at trust in science, when we look at Indigenous communities, when we look at Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, there's going to be healthy scepticism around governments and others across the board for White Australia policy reasons, for simulation reasons, for all sorts of reasons that are very well justified. It's also not their first rodeo. So when we look at communities that are saying COVID is coming, this is another epidemic, there's another challenge, they also shut down communities. Communities have the answers to these. It's about making sure that...
So it's another expression of aberrant power.
Exactly right, yeah.
Sharon?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really important point. It's just the reality, isn't it? It's another form of communication. To me, it's part of that bigger suite of strategic communication. It's not just putting something out for the sake of putting something out, but it's what's the message that one might be trying to disseminate, who to, for what reason, and then what's the best vehicle to do that. So I love doing podcasts, for example. That's a very different audience to something like TikTok. I love doing TikTok. I'm rubbish at it, but I like doing it. It's for what purpose and using the right tools for that, or tools for that.
Let's open it up. So if you've got a comment or a brickbat, whatever, just put up your hand. We'll get Tony Cunningham. Do we get a microphone? Yeah, we can hear. Sorry, do need a mic. One is rushing to you.
The ashes tests are approaching, so good time to talk about timing. Aluminium. It's been raised. We've been talking about this in our University of Sydney vaccine group about when to stand up and say something, because this could be devastating if the ACIP, etc., follow through on that. So should we be proactive? Should we be poised? When we hear more, what's the timing?
So just to explain, aluminium is used as an adjuvant in vaccines, and they want to remove it in the United States of aluminium-free vaccines. They don't exist. If they do exist, very small manufacturers, and the effectiveness is dubious. Therefore, how do you approach that? And what's the message you go out with? I've got an idea about that, but I'll ask Raina, what's your view?
So, I mean, if there's, for public messaging, I would reiterate that in Australia, aluminium was removed from all childhood vaccinations over 20 years ago. It's only in some adult vaccines like flu vaccine. And there's really no evidence that it's a good adjuvant. It increases the immunogenicity of the vaccines. There's no evidence it causes harm in adults. But as I said, you'll probably find a paper coming up in the Journal of the Academy of Public Health telling you how dangerous aluminium is. Yeah. So, this was debated 25 years ago, and at that time, most countries took aluminium out of paediatric vaccines. So it's kind of...
So, Liam, do you want to give some free public... Yeah, please.
Sorry, say that again, Tony.
When it hits the airwaves, what will you do?
What will we do? We will be doing much what Norman will be doing, I suspect, and trying to find the highest quality evidence and the highest quality consensus-based experts. If you're looking for guidance on media strategy on this, I'm probably the wrong person to ask, but I would be thinking that there would be benefits to being aggressive, to coming out and saying, we need to start talking about this, we have the evidence on our side, here's our argument. I think the risk that we face here is less that an overwhelming tide of misinformation will drown us and more that people will lose faith in our institutions. So I think you should also be really giving a lot of thought to saying, how can we ensure that we are the trusted voices on this and that our voices are heard?
Do you want to say something, Sharon?
Yeah, I was going to say this. What we've learned in the analysis in the sort of the structures of obstruction to action is the really clever, organised front footing that some of these other actors are on. And the sort of flip of that has been the social purpose folks sit back and say, we don't do that, we do technical stuff. And this is so political with a small p, and with a big P, with a small p. And it does mean we have to speak up. We have to get organised. We have to work in coalitions. Louise, you're going to be out there constantly speaking about this is a deliberate, organised, well-funded attack on X, Y, and Z. But when we're quiet, it doesn't. There's no counter to these other forces.
I'm reminded of, I can't remember the name of the organisation now, the body that sets Australian vaccine policy. ATAGI, yes. When they made some changes during COVID, it caused a lot of worry and distrust in the community. They were also quite inaccessible for us as journalists, created something of a vacuum that other people stood up to fill.
There's a reason for that, but anyway.
I think it's something that you can think about.
Yeah. Raina?
Just the question Tony asked, there's a great video put up by Paul Offit, who's a vaccine expert in the US, showing the actual revenue generated by pharmaceutical companies, compared to the wellness industry, so supplements, vitamins, etc. And I was surprised to see the pharmaceutical revenue was down there and the wellness industry was way up there. So there are financial conflicts of interest by many of these people who are pushing the anti-vaccine agenda. They are selling supplements. They're selling, you know, if you ever watched Alan Jones's stuff in the US, at the end of it he sells supplements. So the wellness industry is a big financial industry. Zero regulation. Well, you know, you can make any claim you want. You can say you'll improve longevity, you know, men's prostate supplements. You can find them on the shelves of Coles and Woolworths, you know, these claims with no evidence to back them, you know, whereas pharmaceuticals are so tightly regulated. Maybe we can take that message and say, look, actually, you know, pharmaceuticals are really well regulated, and the claims that are made are evidence-based. They're not, you know, untested. Like,
Tess has written a book.
Yeah, hi. Thanks. Just leveraging off what Norman was intimating before about working with responsible journalists and what Sharon was intimating about actually being active. For example, developing strategic partnerships with reputable journalists. So my first TikTok was with ABC. It was also their first TikTok, and it was myth-busting. It had 72,000 views in 24 hours. We need to be out there, but if we work with responsible journalists, we have probably more control over the narrative. So my question is how, Sharon, in what you're describing, do we develop strategic partnerships with communities, with reputable journalists that are forewarned, planned and ready to go when rubber hits the road?
Well, I suppose there's immediate colleagues here who are obviously very sympathetic. I think it's a game of tactics, to be honest. I don't think it's just here's a simple thing. It's sitting down in a room, group of people working out tactics for how to do that, exactly that. I mean, I've got lots of thoughts how you would do it, but it is taking the time, creating the space, doing a power analysis. I do nothing without doing a power analysis, seeing who I think has influence for policy, for regulation. Haven't done it for media. But really deliberately doing that. Wouldn't it be fantastic, say within the academy, Louise, I keep putting all this additional work on for the academy. But imagine in the academy if we had a little, well, some organisations call it the war room, but I don't like that language. But you're really deliberately working out how we're doing this.
So, I mean, the formula was really got to its height with tobacco campaigns, and they brought together unlikely bedfellows. And, it was the College of Surgeons that got seatbelts, for example. So who would have thought? But because it was the College of Surgeons, they got traction. Also, random breath testing, College of Surgeons. Tobacco, AMA was really involved, hitherto known as this conservative medical body, but because they were conservative, they got there. So it is exactly that, thinking that through. And I'm just not sure those coalitions have been developed around alcohol and gambling with the same effectiveness. Sorry, I was yeah. Sorry, John.
John Prinz. Liam, I appreciated your sort of call for action from the Academy, and we're in the middle of sort of thinking about next steps now, but you hopefully saw our response to the Tylenol, and that was reactive, it was fast, it was, we hope very high quality. But it would be good to get ahead of some of the curves, and I guess the organisations with the best understanding of brewing issues are probably you in journalism, in media. So how do we go about figuring out which curve we need to get in front of right now, given limited resources, et cetera, et cetera?
Hello. I think a lot of that is, a war room isn't such a bad idea if you want to come up with a different name for it. There's a lot of researchers out there who we have come across who are actually trying to do predictive misinformation. What's rising up, what's bubbling away. Tony's already thinking about aluminium, so he's somewhat ahead of the curve. So I think if you're strategic about that, it is possible to be somewhat predictive. I should say on your Tylenol work, I thought that was pretty impressive. There are some groups who are very, very slow to respond, and they just don't get the media coverage. I thought that was quite effective from you guys. I think the other part of it, and this answers an earlier question we got, is about how to talk to journalists. I would encourage you to be building personal relationships. Most journalists like them. We like to hear direct from scientists, particularly learned ones like yourselves, specialist journalists in particular. Your media teams can find them for you. You can have coffee, you can sit down, you can talk to them, and you can reach out to them, because we are not as all-seeing as I think sometimes people believe we are. If you can see something coming, we may not have seen it, and we would like to know and cover it. So I think it's about personal relationships, really.
And to come back to Helena's point, which you've got to be careful. We're not going to be co-opted. So we're not going to be vehicles for your TikTok or Reels on Instagram or what have you. You are going to have to develop that expertise yourself. But the problem there is we've kind of got the audience and the channels. So that comes along with the sort of thing that Liam's talking about, which is when you've got your story there, certainly at the ABC, we are increasingly doing multimedia, like, for example, I think of microplastics last week, or if I do that Four Corners, in the old days, you would just do your Four Corners and walk away. Now you write a 3,000-word piece, which then goes online, properly designed for online consumption. We do reels where you're doing a 90-second vertical. Yes, you can criticize that, but to attract our younger audience, to feed it to the larger thing. So we've got that structure there. So if you do a story that we think is merit, then you will start doing that. But if you want to generate your own interest, you've got to be a bit self-sufficient. So just to give examples, if you follow Instagram, you'll find that there's this nutritionist in the United States, I can't remember her name now, who's just playing the game. And she's playing the game as she knows how it works, she knows how you attract audience, and what she's promoting is evidence-based nutrition, and she's very good at it. And then there's this other guy, I can't remember his name now, the guy who does the quizzical when RFK makes a comment. Have you found him? He's very funny, and so humor is important too, and getting the right personality. So when RFK makes a ridiculous comment, he's on it an hour or two later looking quizzical and giving the opposite evidence. And that's getting to young people, it's bursting the bubble, and he knows how to do it. So you've got to get a few 12-year-olds in the office to help you out there, yes. And you've been waiting a long time, we'll come to you in a sec.
Peter Kissler from Melbourne, really enjoyed the discussion, and I suppose builds on what you were just saying, Norman, about how do you think we should structure, and where does the responsibility lie to address disinformation? Is this something the university should be taking on, bodies like the Academy here? And if they are, they need to have a body of people, probably younger than the ones sitting in this room, who are able, like Norman was saying, to be humorous and engaging. As much as we feel very passionate, sometimes we're not the ones that can engage and get the message across. Surely now with algorithms, we must be able to tap into who these popular nutritionists and the like are spreading disinformation, and then we can immediately, provide a response within a time period to dispel and address that. Who are the institutions that should be responsible for that? Because I don't think we should lean on journalists and the media.
Raina, then Shah.
Well, I think government has a role, both state and federal, because Australia, and we're not Americans, we're not British, we're Australian, and we have a different culture. I think then that's social capital that I think we've got to work with, in that we are more trusting of government than Americans or British or many other countries. We tend to be more civic-minded and more willing to go along with things for public good. And I think that's what governments have to work with. So I think the first and foremost role is governments, but then peak bodies like ARMS and other peak bodies. And I have to say, acted very quickly with the Tylenol thing, and there are other bodies that I shall not name that, for bureaucratic reasons, are very slow to respond. So that's a strength you've got here. But I think maybe departments of education and working through schools and, you know, universities as well to reach sort of a broader demographic. Don't know, but I think there is a role, like we're developing an AI sentiment and disinformation tracker, which will track it in real time and tell you if it's going up or down. This is just in vaccines, epidemics, masks, those kind of areas. But ultimately, those kind of tools are needed to be proactive because you need to know. And a great example was during the COVID pandemic in 2021, there were targeted lockdowns in southwest Sydney, which is a lower socio-economic area, if you're not from Sydney, large Arabic-speaking population, and not in simultaneous outbreaks in predominantly white areas in the eastern suburbs and northern beaches. There were no lockdowns. So then by August, September, when the rest of the country had vaccination rates of about 90%, they realised the vaccination rates was about 65% in southwest Sydney. And the reason was there was disinformation spreading in Arabic social media, triggered by the sense of outrage that they had been subjected to targeted lockdowns whilst other suburbs hadn't, that vaccines were, you know, harmful and a way to control them and so on. So having those kind of tools, you can get the jump on that kind of movement and understand quickly in real time where there's a problem, go in and apply health promotion actively. And I think that's what governments are good at doing, you know.
But it's also community development. And later on, you're going to hear from Kamalini Lukuge from Emily Banks' group, who did a lot of that community development in southwest Sydney and then went into Melbourne. We need to make this the final point.
I'm going to be, I just want to say thanks so much. So I'm president of the ACT AME here in Canberra, and I've found one of the most interesting parts of my job over the last 18 months has been the science communication. And I think the two things that I'd really encourage is if you've got great data, make yourself available, because often the time between when we get a question and going on air can be as little as 2 minutes. So if we've got people that we can call and say, hey, can you give me the latest update on tobacco? The big campaigns that we've been focusing on have been sugar tax, gambling, advertising reform, and health and climate change and heat waves, and it's so hard to get traction up on the hill. So I really want to say, join a group, connect with a group who's got a voice, because when we get up there, we are one in so many voices trying to advocate for policy change, and we're really getting drowned out. So thanks for everybody who's publishing and researching, whose data I'm trawling when I'm trying to talk about why illegal tobacco has to be tackled, because it makes a real difference when we can get out there in the community and have those conversations. So thank you.
And to Peter's point, and Helena's is fleet of foot. Thanks. Capture the moment. And the paracetamol and autism one, we kind of knew it was coming. And we were on air 20 minutes after, and we were doing reels. We were doing all the 1 million downloads within a couple of hours. So if you hit that spot, you go to a very large audience and you burst the bubble very quickly, if indeed there was ever going to be a bubble in Australia. Because guaranteed, what we really want in Australia is Trump to come out with a strong anti-vax statement and then everybody opening up their arms for vaccination. Please thank our panel.